seek ultimate reality is to follow explanations until explanations end. And when explanations end, what remains? I'm looking for what remains. Physicists see fundamental laws. Believers see God. Some see consciousness. I'd love to see consciousness as ultimate reality. But isn't consciousness an unnatural choice? Isn't consciousness produced by brains? Aren't brains evolutionary accidents? Not so, say a few scientists. While brains facilitate human consciousness, cosmic consciousness generates brains and everything else. What motivates this coronation of consciousness as the cause of all reality, the progenitor of existence? Is consciousness ultimate reality? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. I'd like consciousness to go beyond the physical world, but must I reject the reality of the physical world? Some scientists assert that consciousness causes everything. But how can scientists who study the physical world come to the extreme belief that the physical world is derived from consciousness? What evidence? What arguments? In the West, the notion that ultimate reality is consciousness is not mainstream. The scientists who so elevate consciousness are not mainstream. Could they shake up my thinking? Consciousness as ultimate reality is often associated with Eastern philosophy and religion, perhaps originating in ancient India. I begin with an Indian-American physician and teacher whose work is predicated on the primacy of consciousness, Deepak Chopra. Deepak, among scientists and philosophers who take consciousness seriously, many of them now say that consciousness is another fundamental part of the universe. Do you feel that consciousness is ultimate reality and everything else is derivative from consciousness?
The short answer is yes. Consciousness, defined as awareness, is ultimate reality. It's truth with a capital T. Now, scientists give labels to their experiences: electromagnetism, gravity, strong and weak interactions. Some of them are perceptual experiences. Gravity is a perceptual experience. I feel heavy, okay? It holds me here on this chair so I don't fly, which I can quantify in equations and all that. Electromagnetism is a word to describe certain behaviors. So everything that we call the four forces of nature, all mental, mathematical activities in consciousness, they are words we have created, and now we hold these words to represent fundamental truth. But all they are is perceptual and conceptual experiences in consciousness. There's no reality to any of that, okay? That's what science does. It creates a language, it creates a description of a conceptual or perceptual experience. So this is what reality is. Reality is none of that. What's a particle? It's a space-time event in consciousness. It's a happening in consciousness. There's nothing outside of consciousness.
But that's pure speculation, because those events are repeatable events. They are the kinds of things that people from different cultures, different walks of life, different experiences of all different kinds can agree upon.
Systems of thought that we agree in.
But everybody agrees.
Yeah, but you go to a religious ideology,
and on consciousness, everybody disagrees.
Okay, wait, because nobody has experienced it directly. Okay, that's why they disagree. They think of it as perception, cognition, all the things that are not consciousness, okay? Consciousness is not a system of thought. It is what gives rise to all systems of thought.
How then does consciousness create everything else?
Consciousness experiences itself as forms of consciousness. Color is a qualia, or a form of consciousness within consciousness. Sound is a form of consciousness within consciousness. There's no sound in the world. It's all vibration of molecules. In fact, there is no world. The world is a qualia gestalt, okay? And it's all forms of consciousness within consciousness that exist. Everything else is a perceptual illusion, including your own body. It doesn't exist.
Deepak is not shy and he does not equivocate. Only consciousness is real, all else is illusion. It's jarring to hear, radically at odds with our everyday perceptions, what we see, what we hear. Those are so real. Consciousness is so ethereal. Absurd? Perhaps not so. Here's the argument. How do we know those are so real? Only via consciousness. We have one window on reality, and consciousness is it. Is the claim all mysticism and philosophy? Any science involved? Since perception helps make the case for consciousness as ultimate reality, I turn to a cognitive scientist, an expert on visual perception, Donald Hoffman. Don, is consciousness ultimate reality, and how would you get there?
Yes, I do take consciousness as being the fundamental reality. The burden on me then is first to say, what do I mean by consciousness? And I want a science of consciousness, not a hand wave. So the burden is on me to give a mathematically precise model of what I mean by consciousness. The goal is to take that precise mathematical model of consciousness and show, for example, that it precisely gives rise to our current physics. Then I can begin to try to show that it's at least consistent to take consciousness as fundamental and to say that the physical world is simply the contents of consciousness.
It doesn't seem conceivable that you can model consciousness with the same type of mathematical rigor that physicists can simulate and model the physics of subatomic particles.
It turns out it's quite easy to do it. If you think about it, we take for granted that we can give mathematical models of space and time, but if you just look at space and say, how do you assign numbers to points in this space? It was very, very bright people who figured out how to assign numbers to the physical world, and then all of a sudden this whole thing took off. Well, they've done the hard work. We can now do it with consciousness. So I can say, for example, in the case of color perception, let the set X be the set of John's color perceptions. I can quantify over his color perceptions. I can start talking about transformations of his color perceptions, and I can use all of the tools of mathematics to do that. So I can say, here's a probability space of my conscious color experiences. Here's a probability space of the kinds of actions I decide to take. And I can then talk about maps among them. And I can get a mathematically precise model.
I can follow that. You are now generalizing John's color perception, but that doesn't represent John's color perception. That's a totally different category of stuff. Whereas the two masses in the gravitational equation those are the real things that you're talking about.
So in the case of Newton and F equals G M1 M2 over R squared, that equation, so you have the masses M1 and M2, those are just numbers.
Right.
If you write down those numbers, they won't be heavy.
Right.
You won't fill any mass to them.
Right.
So
there's a direct correspondence. You can understand that.
There is. Everybody in the field who does psychophysics uses mathematical models to represent the color experiences that they're measuring or the motion experiences and so forth.
And your claim is that that's the equivalent of assigning a number to the mass of an object.
That's exactly right. When you do it in physics...
Does anybody agree with you on that?
Well, I think that...
Nobody at this table does.
Well, in psychophysics, it's the standard approach.
I'm sure that's true, but that's answering a slightly different question.
Okay.
The question is it the same thing as assigning a number to two masses of body?
Oh, I think it's absolutely the same kind of thing in the sense that all you're doing with the mathematics is trying to write down a formal structure that you think mirrors the key features of the domain of interest.
Right.
So if I do a simulation of the weather, you don't expect to get wet. You don't need an umbrella to go check it out.
Right.
And if I give you a simulation of a mathematical model of consciousness, I'm not going to, create conscious being. There's no ghosts that are going to appear. So the mathematics is what it is. It's only useful to the extent that it actually allows us to predict our future experimental results.
Right.
And so that's the way I'm using it for consciousness. We're doing science.
I like Don's ambition, but even if conscious behaviors could be simulated, our personal, private, inner awareness seems radically distinct from non-sentient objects. I also cannot imagine how equations that describe mental perception of sight and sound can generate fundamental physics of particles and forces. What motivates these scientists to claim that consciousness is ultimate reality? I meet a medical doctor, a liver pathologist, who has come to believe that all things are conscious, Neil Theise.
If you had asked me whether I believed a panpsychist position as opposed to an emergentist position about consciousness 2 years ago, I wouldn't have had an opinion. Now, I'm surprised to discover I do. What's meant by those is an emergentist position is that consciousness is something that emerges from the universe when it is sufficiently complex, like a human brain. The panpsychist position is that consciousness is something that pervades the universe side by side with matter energy, or a part of it, or maybe actually is the stuff out of which all of this arises. Let me select a metaphor that helps the panpsychist point of view. A radio is playing music. You can look at that and go, there must be a tiny little orchestra in there. Wow, they can play classical music and they can play rock. That's really cool. You open it up, there's no orchestra there. What the radio is doing is it's a transducer of the radio waves that we can hear. So the radio is taking this infinite, vastly information-rich thing and narrowing its scope so we can hear music. That could be how brains work. There's consciousness out there and the brain transduces that.
Isn't that a rather long jump that you've made?
No, I don't think so. And I think it's a pretty apt one, actually. I mean, that's pretty cool.
What are the pieces of evidence that you're using or that's drawing you in that direction?
Two sets. One, there is this sentience argument that I don't find any place where it's absent. I don't find where it wasn't here and now it's emerging. That makes me think it's not an emergentist thing.
You find a continuum.
Yeah.
Okay, that's
yeah.
one. Anything else?
Yeah. There is the experience I have from contemplative practice. I'm a Zen Buddhist student. I've been meditating for 25 years. But I have had experiences in meditation where my mind is not something that feels like it's coming from my brain. My experience of my mind extends beyond all boundaries, is infinite, is clear, is rich in light and information. Some people would call it pure awareness. Maybe that's a delusion produced by my brain, but that's not my experience of it. And that makes me think, okay, maybe I'm perceiving something fundamental about the world using my mind, about mind.
I myself have not had such contemplative experiences, but if I did, why would I assume that their origins were cosmic? How could I reject the skeptical argument that mystical feelings are all internal? Apparent dissociation from one's body may seem powerful personal evidence of non-physical realities. But such feelings are common in altered states of consciousness, however induced, drugs, alcohol, sleep deprivation, meditation. Such feelings can be explained by brain processes alone. But what cannot be explained is core conscious awareness. That's my conflict. I can reject scientific justifications for consciousness being ultimate reality, but not that consciousness itself is a great mystery. To solve the mysteries of consciousness, some scientists recruit the mysteries of quantum physics. I visit quantum popularizer Fred Alan Wolf. Though few quantum physicists take his speculations seriously, Fred is undaunted. Fred, working particularly in quantum mechanics, do you see consciousness as something that's built up from the more fundamental things of brain function and then kind of emerging, or is consciousness something that is fundamental and irreducible in itself?
It's fundamental and irreducible. There's no way that you're going to build it up. It's just like having the proton or even the quark and trying to find everything based upon it being the fundamental, when the quantum field is really the fundamental, which is an invisible thing. It's the same question. The things that consciousness does are the things that we call normal awareness of whatever it is. But it itself is difficult to contemplate as it itself because it's not a thing in of itself. It's not limited by space or time. We can see more of it, but not actually see it when we go down at the level of the quantum field, which is not a material thing.
It would seem that the burden of proof is on you because neuroscientists can show very strong correlations. Some would even go to causation between activities in the brain and our sensory, visual, auditory, motor. What you're talking about is kind of ethereal.
Well, it may be ethereal, but if you actually ask materialists how they can prove from whatever they look at that there's a willful intent operating in that body. If you can find their way of proving that, then I would agree with them, but they can't.
So one of the tests that you're using is willful intent. How do you have willful intent in a purely materialistic world?
You don't. You can't unless it's a machine. And we're not machines because we're shapers of possibilities into realities. That's what quantum physics predicts. It predicts that a mind or something, an observer, which is not material, shapes materiality.
So what are the implications of that? Is then willful intent, wherever it occurs, the critical factor in giving us this sense that consciousness is a real, independent, irreducible part of the world?
I think it is. And it is now, I think, of an interest if willful intent can be discovered in any materialistic way. But I don't think it can, because there's this process in quantum physics where we can't mathematize. We can't put it in a machine and make it work. We can't really see how it is that we shape possibilities, compact the wave function or collapse the wave function. We can't see that process in any kind of material way.
Is there anything else other than willful intent which gives robustness and actualizes this concept of consciousness?
The necessity of there being an abstract world prior to a material world. That if we try to explain everything in terms of a material world, we end up losing a lot of stuff that we can't explain. Whereas if we assume there is an abstract mental world, the material world suddenly becomes more explainable. I have to go back to the whole vision of the Platonic universe. It's there that I think we are being led. The reason I see that is that each of us has a sense of what's beyond the blur of our own particular way of seeing. In other words, we each have a Platonic ideal. And I believe that can only come because the Platonic world is the real world.
Fred starts with quantum physics, but then finds a deeper reality, rooted in consciousness or even in an abstract Platonic world. Quantum physics does indeed manifest strange traits, but building a world edifice on this shaky foundation seems at best premature. I might like reality to be remystified, which is why I should hear the critics. I meet a physicist known for his unconventional ideas, all based on his belief that the laws of physics, not consciousness, is ultimate reality, Frank Tipler. Some philosophers have taken that concept of consciousness and made it fundamental to the universe.
I think that's fundamentally misconceived. I think that all of reality, human beings, everything that goes to make us up is fully subject to physical law. The human soul exists, and it's immaterial, but it's a computer program. You should think of the human mind, the human soul, the human consciousness as the result of a computer program being run on a wet computer, which is called the human brain. That we can actually quantify thoughts using the same language that we use for information theory. So there is nothing in the human consciousness that is outside the laws of physics and not fully capable of being described in complete detail by the laws of physics.
So that means that consciousness, our sense of soul, or a personal awareness is not only derivative from the laws of physics, but in essence, it's no different than a chair, which is also derived from the laws of physics.
It's not quite like a chair. It's more like a word processing program. Now, it's real. It's immaterial, but it's still real. But what is that program? It's just a pattern on a CD. A blank CD, a CD, it's still the same atoms. What has changed, what has made a word processing program valuable, why you have to pay for it, is the change in the pattern of the atoms on the CD. But notice the pattern is immaterial. The pattern is rearranging the atoms rather than the atoms itself. The atoms are the matter. The pattern is truly immaterial. The soul is the same thing.
So you're using the term immaterial, not in the sense of non-physical, but in terms of something imposed on the matter or a pattern of the matter, but it is the matter itself. It's not non-physical.
Well, the laws of thermodynamics, the first two laws, the first one says conservation of energy. That applies to matter, to the material. We also have the second law of thermodynamics, which involves a concept called entropy. Entropy is the same sort of stuff as the soul. It is a law which governs pattern creation. So here you have, in the laws of physics, distinction between body and soul. The first law of thermodynamics concerns the body, concerns matter, concerns energy. The second law of thermodynamics controls information, controls pattern generation, controls and describes the spiritual world. The spiritual world is real, and it's there already in the physics.
To Frank, consciousness is derivative. Only the laws of physics are fundamental. In fact, Frank almost deifies physics, as if God were another name for physical laws. I like his creativity and his courage, if not his conclusion. Conventional science offers no convincing evidence that consciousness is ultimate reality. If I'm still in this game, I need to go unconventional. Parapsychology claims that realities exist beyond the physical. I meet one of parapsychology's pioneers, Charles Tart. Charlie, as a psychologist who focuses on data, some unusual data to be sure, how do you view this question about the irreducible nature of consciousness?
I view it through the lens of asking how useful is the question. What will different kinds of answers to the question lead you to do, and what might you learn from that? If you view it as fundamental, which is my preference, then you're going to ask questions about consciousness and do research on it that you wouldn't do otherwise. If you make consciousness fundamental, then it becomes very interesting to ask questions like, why don't we experience telepathic contact with each other all the time? Why do we feel separate? Is it simply because consciousness is so focused on a particular physical body and brain that it's ignoring all the other telepathic impressions?
And can we make progress on that? Because if we can't, then maybe consciousness is not fundamental and it is reducible to brain function alone. If consciousness can be something other than the brain and still not be fundamental, it could be derived from something else.
Then let's find out what that is.
Is that possible in principle? Because maybe if we're dealing in the physical world of physical experiments and data, that in principle, those kinds of things, if they exist, are not susceptible to the kinds of observations that we make in the physical world.
When you ask an ultimate question like that, Robert, I'm reminded of something that John Lilly once put very nicely. Something like, in the realm of the mind, what one believes to be true tends to become true. So the moral of all that is be careful what you believe. If you believe in certain kind of limits, your mind may create those limits for you. If you don't, it may not. Try it both ways and see what happens.
Well, I would put that almost in reverse, that because I have a desire for consciousness to be fundamental, I'm going to spend more time and think about it and talk about it. Maybe I'm just fooling myself.
Maybe, but what's the alternative?
Well, the alternative is to face reality and to look at the scientific data, and if the scientific data doesn't support it, put your efforts into things that make sense and not into nonsense.
I'm an experimentalist, I'm a pragmatist. I say try different approaches and see what comes of them and see where it takes you. If you go down some dead ends, that's fine, you learn from the dead ends. If you go to interesting new places, wonderful.
Some say that consciousness doesn't exist. It is illusion. Others that consciousness is the only thing that exists. It is ultimate reality. Here is a decision tree of questions. Is consciousness entirely the product of physical brain? If yes, stop. Consciousness has no cosmic significance. If no, ask, is consciousness reducible to or explainable by something more fundamental? If yes, seek what's more fundamental, perhaps God or something like God. If no, ask, is consciousness the only non-reducible thing? If yes, then consciousness is ultimate reality. If no, then consciousness shares ultimate reality, perhaps with the laws of physics. What if consciousness were ultimate reality? It would not be a person in the sense of a personal God. No intent, no will, no purpose. Would pure awareness even make sense? There could be enduring principles. Our human consciousness could be somehow derived from this cosmic consciousness, and when we die, somehow return back to it. Such cycles or forms of reincarnation typify Eastern religions. I guess it'd be better than stark physicalism, though for me, not much better. I'd hope something else is closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.